Life at Giovanni's restaurant was always bustling with activity, and no one worked harder than their veteran waitress who had been there for 3 years straight. Rain or shine, she'd be there with her notepad, taking orders with a gentle smile that never seemed to fade, even during the most hectic dinner rushes. What none of her coworkers knew was that behind that warm smile lay a story of dreams put on hold. You see, before she started working at Giovanni's, she had been something special. A piano prodigy who could make the keys dance under her fingers like few others could. Her talent had taken her across the country, performing in prestigious venues since she was just 12 years old. Music magazines had written about her extraordinary ability to bring emotion to every note, and her future seemed destined for concert halls and standing ovations. But life has a way of throwing unexpected curves. During what should have been her breakthrough performance at a major music festival, something went terribly wrong. The spotlight's glare, the sea of faces, and the pressure of perfection all came crashing down at once. Her hands froze mid-performance, her mind went blank, and the silence that followed was deafening. The panic attack that struck her on stage that day left deep emotional scars. After that incident, she couldn't bring herself to touch a piano in public again. The mere thought of performing would send her heart racing and her hands trembling. She moved to a new city, looking for a fresh start where nobody knew about her past. Giovanni's became her safe haven, a place where she could just be another face in the crowd, serving plates instead of playing concertos. The restaurant's grand piano sat in the corner of the dining room, occasionally played by hired musicians during special events. Sometimes, during quiet afternoons when she thought no one was watching, she would stop near it, her fingers twitching slightly at her sides as if remembering old songs. Her coworkers would catch her staring at it with a distant look in her eyes, but they assumed she was just taking a brief break from her hectic routine. The regular customers at Giovanni's knew her as the efficient waitress who never mixed up their orders and always remembered their favorite wines. They had no idea that the hands that carried their plates had once graced the keys of concert pianos in front of audiences of hundreds. She preferred it that way. The anonymity felt safe, comfortable, like a warm blanket she could wrap herself in. The owner of Giovanni's, a kind-hearted man who had inherited the restaurant from his father, had noticed something special about her from the day she applied for the job. There was a grace to her movements, a certain rhythm in the way she navigated between tables that seemed almost musical. He'd often wondered about her story, but respected her privacy too much to pry. Then came that fateful evening when everything changed. The restaurant was packed, as it usually was on Friday nights. The air was filled with the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations, and the rich aromas of Italian cuisine. She was doing what she always did, taking orders, serving dishes, and keeping everyone's glasses full. Little did she know that a group of regular customers had plans that would force her to confront the past she'd been running from for so long. This story of hidden talent and unexpected redemption was about to unfold in ways that would surprise everyone at Giovanni's, most of all herself. Sometimes the greatest moments of triumph come when we least expect them. And on this particular evening, a cruel joke would transform into something beautiful that no one in the restaurant would ever forget. The group of regular customers who started it all were seated at their usual corner table that evening. They were the kind of people who thought money could buy them anything, including entertainment at someone else's expense. The 5 of them had been coming to Giovanni's every Friday for months, always ordering the most expensive wines and making sure everyone knew just how important they were. That night, they were celebrating a successful business deal, and the expensive wine was flowing more freely than usual. The leader of the group, a man in an expensive suit who always sat facing the room like he owned the place, had been watching their waitress throughout the evening. He kept pointing out to his friends how she seemed to move differently from the other staff. There was something almost musical about the way she walked between tables. "Look at her," he said, swirling his wine glass. "She carries those plates like she's conducting an orchestra." The others laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that comes from joy. It was the kind that usually leads to trouble. One of the women in the group, wearing enough jewelry to open a small shop, chimed in. Maybe she thinks she's too good for this job. Someone should take her down a notch. The conversation took a nasty turn as they started making up stories about their waitress's background. I bet she failed at whatever she really wanted to do in life, another one said, adjusting his gold watch. That's why she's serving us instead of doing something better. They had no idea how close to the truth they were, or how their words might affect someone's life. As the evening wore on, and the wine bottles emptied, their comments got meaner. They started whispering and pointing whenever she passed by their table, thinking they were being subtle, but actually being obvious to everyone around them. Other diners started feeling uncomfortable, some even shooting disapproving looks in their direction. Then someone noticed the grand piano in the corner. Hey, wouldn't it be hilarious if we made her try to play that thing? The ringleader suggested, his words slightly slurred. We could offer her some ridiculous tip. She'll probably embarrass herself completely. The idea caught on like wildfire among the group. They spent the next 20 minutes planning their little joke. They decided to make it a public challenge, something she couldn't easily refuse without looking bad in front of everyone. The woman with all the jewelry suggested they film it on their phones, probably thinking about social media likes. Another guy even pulled out his wallet, counting out bills to wave around as bait. What they didn't notice was how their waitress's hands shook slightly every time she passed the piano, or how her eyes lingered on it when she thought no one was watching. They were too wrapped up in their own amusement to see the hint of sadness that crossed her face whenever she looked at the instrument. They had no clue that their cruel joke was about to backfire in the most spectacular way. The restaurant's other customers could sense something was brewing. The regular diners who knew and appreciated their waitress's quiet efficiency were watching the group with growing concern. Even the other servers had picked up on the tension, exchanging worried glances as they passed the table of conspirators. As dessert time approached, the group could barely contain their excitement. They were like children planning a prank, except these were grown adults who should have known better. They kept checking the piano, then looking at their waitress, then grinning at each other like they were about to witness something incredibly entertaining. Little did they know that their attempt at public humiliation was about to turn into something entirely different. Sometimes life has a way of turning the tables on bullies, and this evening at Giovanni's was about to become a perfect example of that. The moment arrived as the waitress approached their table, carrying a tray of tiramisu and espresso. The restaurant had settled into that peaceful lull that often comes with dessert time, when conversations grow softer and the evening starts winding down. It should have been a quiet, pleasant moment. Instead, it became the setting for what the group thought would be their evening's entertainment. The man in the expensive suit cleared his throat loudly, making sure nearby tables could hear him. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying across the restaurant. "We've been watching you all evening, and we have a little proposition for you." The waitress paused, carefully setting down their desserts, her face showing a mix of confusion and concern. "We couldn't help but notice how gracefully you move around the restaurant," the woman dripping in jewelry added, her voice syrupy sweet but with an edge to it. "Almost like a performer." The waitress's hands tightened slightly on her serving tray, but she kept her professional smile in place. That's when the man pulled out his wallet, making a show of counting out 5 crisp $100 bills. He laid them on the table, spreading them out like cards in a poker game. $500, he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "It's yours if you can play just one piece on that piano over there." The restaurant fell silent. Forks stopped mid-bite, conversations halted, and all eyes turned to watch the scene unfold. The only sounds were the soft classical music playing through the speakers and the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen. The waitress stood completely still, her face going pale. "Come on," another member of the group urged, his voice filled with fake encouragement that barely masked his mockery. "Anyone can play a little tune. It doesn't have to be anything fancy." They were all leaning forward now, phones discreetly positioned to record what they assumed would be an embarrassing moment. The waitress's hands began to shake. Anyone watching closely would have seen the color drain from her face, the way her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she looked like she might drop her tray or run from the room. The kitchen staff, who had gathered at the service door after hearing the commotion, watched with worried expressions. Some of the regular customers who knew her began to shift uncomfortably in their seats. An elderly couple who came in every Tuesday evening looked ready to say something in her defense. The atmosphere in the restaurant had become thick with tension, like the air before a storm. The owner started making his way across the restaurant floor, sensing that something was wrong. He had always been protective of his staff, and he could see this situation was spinning out of control. But before he could reach them, something changed in the waitress's expression. Maybe it was the smirking faces of the group, or maybe it was years of running from her past. Whatever it was, something sparked in her eyes. She carefully placed her serving tray on an empty table nearby. Her hands were still trembling, but there was a new steadiness in her movements. The group's ringleader waved the money again, thinking her hesitation was just building up to the embarrassment they were expecting. "Well," he pressed, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's easy money. Unless, of course, you can't play at all." Without saying a word, the waitress smoothed down her apron and turned toward the piano. The restaurant held its collective breath. The group at the table exchanged excited glances, already anticipating their victory. But they had no idea that their cruel joke was about to transform into something none of them would ever forget. The 15 steps from the table to the piano felt like the longest walk of her life. Each step brought back memories she tried so hard to forget. Her mind raced back to that terrible day at the music festival when everything had fallen apart. She could still hear the whispers that followed her offstage, still feel the crushing weight of disappointment in her chest. Her feet stopped halfway to the piano. The restaurant around her seemed to fade away as she stood frozen between past and present. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple, and her heart pounded so loud she was sure everyone could hear it. The group at the table started whispering and snickering, thinking they were about to witness exactly what they'd hoped for, a complete meltdown. The owner of the restaurant had almost reached her now. He was ready to step in, to tell the group to leave and never come back. He could see how pale she'd become, how her hands trembled at her sides. But then he noticed something else. Something in her eyes had changed. The fear was still there, but there was something stronger breaking through. She thought about all the nights she'd stayed late at the restaurant after everyone had gone home. How she'd stand near the piano in the empty dining room, playing entire symphonies in her head while cleaning tables. She thought about how music had once been as natural as breathing, before fear had stolen it away from her. The woman with all the jewelry called out mockingly, "Don't tell me you're scared of a little piano." A few other customers shot angry looks in their direction, but nobody spoke up. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. That's when a strange calm began to wash over her. She remembered what her grandmother used to tell her. Sometimes the biggest act of courage is facing exactly what scares you the most. Her grandmother had been her first piano teacher, patiently sitting beside her as she learned to play simple nursery rhymes. What would she say if she could see her now, letting a group of bullies stop her from doing what she once loved most? The trembling in her hands slowly subsided. She took one deep breath, then another. The kitchen staff watched through the service door, holding their own breath. The other waiters and waitresses had stopped what they were doing, sensing that something important was about to happen. She looked back at the group at the table, who were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Her silence and stillness had started to make them nervous. This wasn't going according to their plan. They had expected stammering excuses or clumsy attempts at playing. Not this quiet determination that was slowly transforming her whole demeanor. Her feet started moving again, this time with purpose. Each step felt more certain than the last. The restaurant's usual background noise had completely disappeared. No clinking glasses, no murmured conversations, not even the sound of cutlery against plates. Everyone was watching, waiting. As she reached the piano, her fingers brushed against the polished wood. How many times had she longed to touch these keys over the past 3 years? How many melodies had she pushed away, telling herself she wasn't ready, that she'd never be ready again? She adjusted the bench and sat down, her waitress apron still tied around her waist. The group that had started all this was leaning forward in their seats, phones still ready to record what they assumed would be their moment of triumph. But they didn't notice how her shoulders had straightened, how her chin had lifted slightly. The owner stepped back, something in her posture telling him she no longer needed rescue. He'd seen many things in his years of running the restaurant, but something told him he was about to witness something extraordinary. As her fingers hovered over the keys, the entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Her fingers touched the piano keys, and for a moment, everything stood still. The cool, smooth ivory beneath her fingertips felt like greeting an old friend. She closed her eyes, took one final deep breath, and began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the air, and the restaurant collectively gasped. The sound was unlike anything they'd ever heard in the restaurant before. This wasn't the casual playing of an amateur musician. This was something else entirely. Her fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed almost impossible, creating music that felt like it was floating on air. The smirks on the faces of the group who had challenged her quickly faded. The man in the expensive suit lowered his phone, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. The woman with all the jewelry sat back in her chair, her face flushing red with embarrassment. None of them had expected this. As she played, something magical happened. The years of fear and doubt seemed to melt away with each note. Her body swayed gently with the music, completely lost in the piece she'd played hundreds of times before. The gentle, dreamy melody floated through the restaurant, touching everyone who heard it. The kitchen staff had quietly emerged from the kitchen, standing in awe as they watched their colleague transform before their eyes. The chef, who was usually yelling about orders, stood completely still, his eyes closed as he listened. One of the younger waitresses wiped tears from her eyes, overwhelmed by the beauty of the moment. The regular customers who had known her for years sat stunned in their seats. The elderly couple who came in every Tuesday held hands across their table, sharing knowing looks. They had always sensed there was something special about her. But this was beyond anything they could have imagined. As the music swelled, diners began to set down their forks and glasses. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Others watched in amazement as her hands danced across the keys, creating sounds that seemed to reach into their very souls. The restaurant owner leaned against the bar, a proud smile on his face as he watched years of hidden talent finally break free. The piece built to its emotional peak, and her whole body moved with the music now. Gone was the nervous waitress who had approached the piano just minutes ago. In her place sat an artist, someone who had found her way home after being lost for far too long. The notes rang out clear and true, filling every corner of the restaurant with their beauty. Even the busy street outside seemed to quiet down, as if nature itself was stopping to listen. Through the restaurant's front windows, passers-by began to pause, drawn by the extraordinary music flowing out onto the sidewalk. Some even came inside, standing quietly by the door, caught up in the magical moment. The group that had tried to humiliate her sat in complete silence, their faces showing a mix of shame and wonder. Their phones lay forgotten on the table. They had wanted to record an embarrassment, but were instead witnessing a triumph. The $500 they had offered as a cruel joke now seemed insignificant compared to the gift they were receiving. As she played the final section of the piece, her confidence grew even stronger. Years of practice and passion poured through her fingers, creating sounds that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. The gentle, flowing notes of the nocturne filled the air like a dream, touching something deep in everyone who listened. Time seemed to stand still in Giovanni's that evening. The daily worries and stress that everyone had brought with them to dinner faded away, replaced by something pure and beautiful. In that moment, They weren't strangers in a restaurant. They were all part of something extraordinary, witnesses to a moment of pure magic that none of them would ever forget. Among the spellbound audience sat a distinguished-looking gentleman who hadn't taken his eyes off the piano since the first note. He was a board member of the city's symphony orchestra, and he knew talent when he heard it. Without making a sound, he pulled out his phone and began recording, his trained ear recognizing something extraordinary in the way she played. The group that had started it all sat in stunned silence. The man in the expensive suit had loosened his tie, looking uncomfortable. The woman with all the jewelry had stopped fidgeting with her bracelets, her eyes fixed on the waitress's hands as they moved across the keys. Their attempt at cruel entertainment had backfired in the most beautiful way possible. The restaurant staff watched with a mixture of pride and amazement. The young busboy, who had always thought of her as just a kind coworker who helped him when things got busy, now stood with his mouth open in awe. The other waitresses, who had worked alongside her for years, exchanged glances of disbelief, wondering how they had never known about this hidden talent. The owner of the restaurant had tears in his eyes. He remembered all the times he'd seen her lingering near the piano during quiet moments, the way she would sometimes stop and listen when others played it. Now he understood the look he'd often caught in her eyes. It wasn't just appreciation for the music, it was longing. Through the windows, more people had gathered on the sidewalk outside. The sound had drawn them in like a magnet, and they pressed their faces against the glass, trying to catch a glimpse of the source of such beautiful music. Inside, regular customers who had known her for years sat transfixed, seeing her in a completely new light. The kitchen staff, who rarely left their stations during service, stood in a line near the kitchen door. The head chef, known for his strict demeanor, had tears running down his face. The dishwasher, who had barely spoken 2 words to anyone, was swaying gently to the music, his eyes closed in appreciation. A food critic, who happened to be dining there that evening, had set down his pen and notebook. He had come to review the restaurant's new menu items, but found himself witnessing something far more noteworthy. His trained eye noticed how even the most jaded-looking customers had been transformed by the music. The elderly couple who had been regular customers for years held hands across their table, sharing knowing looks. They had always sensed there was something special about their quiet, efficient waitress, but this went beyond anything they could have imagined. The wife dabbed at her eyes with a napkin while her husband nodded slowly, a gentle smile on his face. The symphony board member continued recording, his mind already racing with possibilities. In all his years of attending performances and auditions, he had rarely heard such genuine emotion in playing. He could see not just skill in her performance, but something much rarer, true passion and natural talent. Other diners had completely forgotten about their meals. Half-eaten plates of pasta grew cold, glasses of wine sat untouched. Everyone was completely absorbed in the moment, watching as years of hidden talent poured out through the keys of the old restaurant piano. The restaurant's usual evening buzz had been replaced by something magical. The clinking of glasses had stopped, the murmur of conversations had fallen silent, and even the kitchen's usual clamor had ceased. All that existed was the music and the collective amazement of everyone present. As the piece continued, something shifted in the room. This wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It had become a concert hall, and everyone present knew they were witnessing something they would remember for the rest of their lives. The cruel joke that had started it all had transformed into a moment of pure magic, touching every person in the room in ways they never expected. As the final notes of Chopin's Nocturne faded into silence, the restaurant stood completely still. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if everyone was holding onto the last echoes of the music, afraid to break the spell that had fallen over the room. Then, like a wave building from silence, the applause began. It started with a single person, the elderly man who came in every Tuesday with his wife. He stood up, tears in his eyes, and began clapping. Within seconds, the entire restaurant had risen to their feet. The sound of applause filled every corner of the room, growing louder and louder until it seemed the walls themselves might shake. The kitchen staff emerged fully from their stations, still wearing their aprons, clapping with such enthusiasm that their hands turned red. The young busboy whistled loudly, and soon others joined in. Someone shouted "Bravo" from the back of the restaurant, and the cry was taken up by others until the whole place rang with cheers and applause. The waitress at the piano opened her eyes, seeming almost surprised to find herself there. Color flooded her cheeks as she looked around at the standing ovation. The fear that had held her captive for so long had vanished, replaced by something that looked a lot like joy. Her hands, which had trembled so badly just minutes ago, were now steady and strong. The group that had tried to humiliate her sat subdued at their table, their faces red with shame. The man in the expensive suit stood up slowly, picked up the $500 from the table, and walked to the piano. But before he could speak, other diners had begun approaching, leaving tips of their own. $20 bills, $50 bills, even $100 bills began piling up on top of the piano. The symphony board member made his way through the crowd. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, placing it carefully among the money on the piano. "We have auditions next week," he said warmly. "I'd very much like to see you there." His voice was nearly drowned out by the continuing applause, but she understood, nodding through tears of joy. The restaurant owner walked over and helped her stand, giving her a fatherly hug that spoke volumes. The other waiters and waitresses surrounded her, patting her back and squeezing her hands. The head chef emerged from the kitchen and bowed to her, a gesture of respect that made fresh tears spring to her eyes. Regular customers who had known her for years came up to embrace her, telling her how moved they were. The elderly couple who had started the applause made their way to the piano, the wife hugging her while the husband kept saying, "We always knew there was something special about you, dear. We always knew." Outside, the crowd that had gathered on the sidewalk began coming in, asking if she would play again. The restaurant owner quickly began arranging tables to make more room, as people from the street continued to pour in. Someone asked about her story, and soon the whole restaurant was listening as the owner proudly explained about his talented waitress. The woman with all the jewelry from the group that had started it all approached the piano last. Her face was streaked with tears, her earlier arrogance completely gone. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, not quite meeting the waitress's eyes. "We were cruel, and you showed us what real class looks like. Thank you for sharing your gift with us." That evening marked more than just a return to music. It was a triumph of the human spirit over fear and doubt. The cruel joke had transformed into a moment of beauty that would live forever in the memories of everyone present. As the waitress stood there, surrounded by applause and admiration, her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes the biggest act of courage is facing exactly what scares you the most. From that night forward, the piano at Giovanni's was never silent again. The waitress who had hidden her talent for so long became a regular performer, playing every weekend to packed houses. But more importantly, she'd have finally found her way back to herself, turning a moment meant for humiliation into one of the greatest triumphs of her life.